Bec is a practitioner-researcher whose work focuses on developing hidden disability-inclusive spaces, places, and practices. And as I think someone just pointed out as Bec was coming in as well, she's very, very recently been appointed as the Manager of Disability and Neurodiversity Inclusion at La Trobe University, which sounds like an absolutely fantastic role. Very jealous of that title as well. That's what a great role title to have. Um, so I won't read out any more of Bec's bio because I have a feeling that Bec is probably best positioned to introduce a few of aspects of the history herself. But welcome, Bec, and I will stop sharing my slides and hand right over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being here today. So with the slide presentation today, I want to let everyone know that the slides themselves will be available. Speakers' notes won't be, but the slides themselves will be, and the recording, of course, will be available as well. So I've also shared in the chat the link to the Padlet. So with this Padlet, you'll see there's a few sections on there, including a section at the bottom to ask a question, and you can ask that anonymously and kind of get some input from the Brains Trust here. And I can also respond to different things on there as well. So with the Padlet, as with everything else, you are not expected to use it. You are not obliged to use it. It is a tool that you can select to use if you would like to. So I'm just going to start up my presentation, and with some hope, this will actually work for me. Let me just see. Here we go. And let us endeavour to share. So with this presentation, there is one video in there, which I'm hoping the audio will come through. If it doesn't, I will also share the video link so people will have that available as well. I'll just confirm that you can see the slides at the moment. You should see a beautiful slide saying acknowledgement of country. Perfect. Excellent. We're good to go. So to start off with, I acknowledge that we stand on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. This place, at the meeting spot of the Maribyrnong and Yarra rivers, has been a site for learning, connection and partnership for thousands of years, a place of rest after long travels and for unity after hard endeavours. In this spirit, I invite you to share in the chat and share on the Padlet your own thoughts, your experiences from wherever you travel to us today, and also to support and connect with each other using these tools. This land is and always will be the lands of the First Nations people of Australia. So today we're doing a session called A Rose by Any Other Name, or Why We Have 9 Definitions of Disability in Australia. These will be our approximate timeframes that we'll be looking at throughout the presentation today. I say approximate because that is a degree of flex. We'll be running this session dynamically, meaning it will change when we need it to change. What we will do is we'll work through from an agenda through to our housekeeping, then we'll work on defining disability, and then into our model to impact and definitions to inclusion. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. You are also welcome to ask questions in the chat as we go, or if you're like me and you need that little bit of time for things to marinate, use the Padlet to ask questions on there, or reach out to me via email. My details will be on the last slide. I just like having marination time before I think of anything. Absolutely. So our first task that we'll do today is look at some housekeeping. So I am a practitioner-researcher in hidden disability inclusive service design. My doctorate has focused on the public library sector. However, the findings of this translate to any sector that deals with information, community, public. So that's all libraries, all glamour section, arguably. So my experience has included 15 years experience in management, supervision, coaching, training and policy roles, as well as 10 plus years experience in evidence-based practice, disability inclusive research design, mixed methods research, inclusive recruitment and workplace design. So I am what would be called a qualitative dominant mixed methods researcher, meaning that my research has always incorporated qualitative and quantitative feedback and numbers, of course, and from that I draw my conclusions out of. So for a visual description, I am reasonably short. I have green eyes, blonde-ish hair, which is currently also dyed pink. I'm wearing a pink dress and I'm also wearing an overshirt with some embroidery on it. So for today's session, the reason why we're running it is there's no one way to define disability. Our definitions of disability, the language we use, and even the modifications and adjustments we think about all come down to our frameworks for understanding different disability. So our ways of thinking about disability, the assumptions, the stereotypes we make, everything like this, all change how we prepare for and expect disability to be experienced. So through our expectations and preparation, we then set a boundary around who is included when we think about disability and who is included in the workplaces and practices that we do. So for today's session, what we're really wanting to help everyone feel more confident in is explaining how those differences in the ways we define and talk about disability can create inclusion barriers that are experienced differently by different people, to understand the difference between the language we use, such as disability and non-medical terms, and to clearly articulate what we mean by neurodivergence, and also to feel more confident communicating the differences between medical and social models of disability and identifying the model used in the workplace. So as part of this, I have developed a content note. A content note is different to a content warning. A note tells us that there is sensitive material ahead, and the content warning tells us that it is expected this material may trigger anxiety or distress. So I've experienced invalidation and discrimination in my personal and in sometimes my previous professional roles. My use of the word content note is not intended to minimise the stress that this content can cause. It's a pragmatic choice to use this language because for many of us, invalidation of our experiences and discrimination will be part of our life experiences. When we minimise, ignore or bypass these experiences, or when we deliberately avoid saying words such as, or names such as Judy Sinner or Hans Asperger, we wash over these experiences and pretend they don't exist. Our job isn't to ignore our history. Our job is to do better and to be better than those who have came before us. Our job is to lay a foundation that creates a more inclusive space for those who come after us. So given this, please engage with this presentation in a way that supports your mental, physical and emotional well-being. This includes stepping away if you need to, and it also includes looking at the content with an open mind and a willingness to challenge your own thinking and hear different voices and experiences. As part of this, we also need to remember, as we said before, that no one speaks for everyone. Everyone's experiences are distinct, and their experiences and what is discussed today may not perfectly align with your own experiences, and that's good because that's an area where we can challenge our own understanding and learning. So one way that I've designed this presentation to support your mental, physical and emotional well-being is through developing a cognitive overload and sensory safe session. So what are they? Let's have a look. And hopefully the audio will come through. If not, there are subtitles. Perfect. So on the screen, you'll see a QR code that will lead you to the Padlet. This Padlet talks about cognitive and sensory safety. It asks you for your thoughts on what this means, and it also asks if you've got any questions as well. With this Padlet, keep the link and feel free to come back to it and reflect on it, marinate in the learnings, post questions as you think about different things. You're all very welcome to do so. This is a community brains trust, so to speak, and we are all welcome to engage in the post and the contents there. So now that we've talked about who I am and what we're going to be doing today, let's go into the actual what we're doing. So the first section that we're going to look at is how we define disability and neurodivergence. So the words that we use can include or exclude or ostracize different people, even if that's not our intention. The same goes for our definitions. The way we define labels and experiences like disability and neurodivergence creates a boundary around who is allowed to be in that group and whose voices we will permit to be heard. So our choice of language and the words that we use around disability inclusion can be really important tools in developing an inclusive practice, both at work and in everyday life. So in Australia, the way that we think about and understand disability has changed a lot over time. So for First Nations people of Australia, disability was and continues to be understood within a framework of inclusion and belonging. Disability was simply part of human diversity. So even today, there are different First Nations communities who actually don't have words for disability or for different types of disability, such as autism, because these aren't things that are bad or need to be called out or anything like that. It's just part of who a person is. So following the invasion, colonisation of Australia, our societal values around disability, or how we thought about disability as a group of people, changed as westernised values of output and productivity were kind of imported in with the arrival of white invaders, colonisers. So this all led to a change in our social values. So around the gold rush periods, we also see how the discovery of gold itself and population influxes led to a bit of another change in how we saw disability to one of being a problem. So we start to see disability as a threat to society, as something that needs to be treated and managed, and we need to segregate people who are disabled away from the rest of us. This is partly so that they could receive care. This was the original purpose of asylums or institutions, to be able to provide care. But of course, this removal of people from society and their segregation out of society also had the strange consequence of suddenly freeing up fertile farmland and gold plots. So that's really strange, right? Really strange. So we start to see disability seen as something that means you cannot be as productive as a normal person. You are not having the same output as a normal person, and you're a problem, and you need to be removed from society so that people who are normal and regular can have more access to these resources and do a better job with it, basically. So, the ending of the World Wars and the return of disabled service person presented a really new challenge to this understanding of disability as a problem, something to look away, something to ignore. We were suddenly confronted as a society with the need to support and rehabilitate our returned soldiers and service people. So this is where we start to see initiatives really pushing forward on the idea of treatment, support, and help. So instead of locking people away and not really doing anything to support these people, just providing for food, accommodation, and those sort of things, we start to see a movement on how can we kind of like connect with society? How can we focus on treating people? How can we help fix some of the issues that might be happening, such as someone who might have lost an eye or had facial deformity due to exposure to, say, weapons and these sort of things? How can we start to give them support and include them into society? So lastly, of course, we have advocacy. So this occurred over a long period, but it really picked up in the 80s. So we start to see disabled people thinking about self-determination and also self-representation and how that's tied to overcoming social oppression and disadvantage. So we went from seeing disability as something that needed to be treated, supported, but still kind of removed, to this idea of disabled people need to have their own voice in what is happening and in what we're doing around support. So this doesn't mean, though, that advocacy was across the board for everyone. Some people were better heard in advocacy movements than other groups, and that's a trait that continues today. So as the recent Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect, Exploitation of People with a Disability, or in short form, Disability Royal Commission, found, there's around 9 different definitions of disability used in Australia today. So even our National Statistics Agency, the ABS, or Australian Bureau of Statistics, uses at least 3 different definitions of disability depending on what they're measuring. So this ties down to, the reason for this ties down to what we discussed on that previous slide, that we have changed our way of understanding disability as a society over time. These changes have changed how we think about disability, as in what causes disability, how disability will be experienced, what disability will look like, how we should react to disability, all of these different things. So with our modern ways of understanding disability, we now think about them in respect to disability models or disability groups. So what this means is, in Australia, the way that we understand disability is currently often split into 2 different camps: social model of disability and medical model of disability. So the medicalised framework looks at disability as an individual medical issue, and the social framework starts to think about disability as something that's an interaction social issue. So disability models in the whole need to be thought of as frameworks for understanding. These frameworks have formed over time as we think about disability and as our norms and values and ideas and understandings around disability have changed. So these models help us to understand who will have a disability, what disability will be caused by, what it will look like, and how disability will be experienced. So the reason I highlight the medical and social models there are because oftentimes when we talk about our workplaces, the ways we define disability, the ways we think about disability, we often start to use words like, oh, that's a medical model of disability, or that's a medicalised understanding of disability, or that's a social model of disability, or that's a social model of understanding, without actually looking at the ways we're defining and understanding and talking about these terms and whether they actually are in fact what we're saying they are. So we have a legacy in Australia around our usage of disability language that ties down to the medical model of disability. So this medical model once more looks at disability as something that needs to be treated, looked after, perhaps even cured sometimes. The medical model is one of the most influential models in Australia, and often, even when we're talking about using a social model definition of disability, we're actually still using the medical model. So on the screen are 3 different examples of how disability is defined by a representative advocacy group, a service provider, and by a university. Tying back to the previous slides, as I said, everyone has a slightly different way of understanding disability, slightly different definition and scope of that. But when you're looking at these three definitions, you might start to see some similarities in them. Thinking back on the previous slide, when we talked about the medical and social model, you might see elements of some of the language bleeding through here. So disability is something that is inside a person. Disability is something that happens in interaction. Disability is something that can be measured and fixed. You'll also see that the language used in each of these definitions is similar in some ways. So, for example, each of them include the words people with disabilities, not disabled people, people with disabilities. So with each of these definitions, even though they are different, you can see how they're also similar to each other because they've all been formed underneath that understanding of disability framed by that medical approach to disability. People with disability indicates that the person's disability is not, let me go at that, not something that is within them, not something that is part of them, it's just something that is within them. So, say, for example, the idea with this language is that we have people with disability as compared to people with gayness, as compared to people with womanness. So we say woman, or we say female, or we say gay, or LGBTIQA+. We say this sort of language because the idea is that there is nothing inherently wrong with those identities. When we use language like people with disability, we're actually going back to the medical model of framing disability as something that's an issue inside the person that needs to be treated. So superimpose this with person with cancer, person with sore hand, all of these sort of things. It represents the idea that that disability is something that the person carries with them, not something that is integral to their identity. And that is because even though those definitions are different, they've each been formed underneath the same context and within the same environment. So understanding how our language forms from our models is really important because, as we saw with those definitions, even though we might work in a workplace that says it's formed underneath the social model of disability, those wider contextual influences from society still bleed through to how that organisation looks at, talks about, frames, considers, measures disability. This changes the language that they use to talk about disability, changes what they think of as disability, changes what we think of as modifications and everything like that. So the ways that we frame disability then create those boundaries around who's allowed in that space, or frame neurodivergence, who's allowed in that space, whose voices are needed to be heard. So all of this is really important because even when our context changes, so say we might go into a school that uses a social model of disability, those wider social impacts, those wider ideas of how disability should be experienced and what causes it will continue to shape the impact we have and what we consider to be impact. Let's go into that one. So the medical model, like we said, is the most influential in Australia, and this guides how we understand and think about disability at a really broad level. But what does it mean at a practical level? Let's look at that. So as we've seen, the concept of disability is not value neutral. There's no one universal idea of disability across all of Australia, and the ideas of how we create disability and neurodivergence are influenced by those wide contextual factors. This is why we can't just say, oh, that's disability accessible, because disability will mean different things to different people, even though they might have that same contextual understanding and framework. So say, for example, I might define disability as something that stops people from talking, or disability as something that impacts on hearing. Someone else might define disability as something that impacts on their back or how they go about moving. We're still talking about disability as something that is inside the person, that has a functional impact and is something that is physical. But what we think of, the nuance of what disability is defined as in our language is very different, which means if I put something out saying disability accessible, meaning it's got a hearing loop, and someone turns up with a wheelchair and discovers, well, you don't mean disability accessible to me. These are where those confusion points come in. So we have to be able to understand context, the impact of those understandings and models, and the nuance of how this all comes together. So with our society, we also, of course, have different laws, legislations, and understandings around disability. So these are not removed from the influence of these contextual nuances and these models. Legislation is formed in the same environment as our definitions. The ways that disability is understood in this legislation is formed in the same environment as these models and contextual understandings, etc. Which means that we might have a federal piece of legislation, such as the Disability Discrimination Act, that works on the basis of removing discrimination for people on the basis of disability. But the way disability is understood in that act and the barriers that people encounter in proving discrimination based on disability are informed by the medical model of disability. And that understanding is that disability is something inside a person. Disability is something that impacts on how people function. Disability is something that can be measured. Disability is something that can be proven. This is the framework in which this legislation forms. And Australia is not alone in that. Even our international legislation, our international guidelines, will be informed by an approach that disability is something that can be proven, that can be understood, and that can be captured in these sort of measurable ways. So let's look what that means for our definitions. So as we spoke about, the way that we think about disability in an organisation, we might use words such as that's a social model to think about disability. It's not. We might say, well, this is a medical model, this is a medical social model. Again, all of these come together. Our legislation reinforces and is reinforced by the ways that we understand disability as a society, which is medicalised. Our language that we use around disability is medicalised. The ways that workplaces understand disability is medicalised. All of these things change the nuance of what it means to be disabled in the workplace and to talk about disability in these environments. This all ties into the idea as well of the unconscious bias that we have in how we think about disability and how we talk about disability, how we define disability, how we understand disability in the model. We all have biases, and biases are as much part of these ways of thinking about disability as they are about our own definitions. So some of these biases are unconscious. We don't even think about them. We don't understand them. We don't really plan for them. They're just unconscious. They're just how we think immediately in a moment about something. So our biases, our models, our definitions, our assumptions, and our expectations of disability all come together. To be able to understand the expectations and the ways that we expect disability can be supported in a place like a workplace, we need to understand the assumptions behind that. Behind the assumptions, we need to understand the definition, and behind the definition, we need to understand the model. So our assumptions are beliefs that we decide are true, even if we don't have evidence to support the belief. A really common assumption is that people who like dogs are friendlier than people who like cats. So we then change our behaviours based on these assumptions. So, for example, maybe more of our friends have dogs than cats. And we then interpret that as evidence that our assumption is correct. Dog people are friendlier than cat people because all of my friends like dogs. Hypothesis proved. Our assumptions sit next to the expectations that we have about people or our stereotypes. So our stereotypes are generalized, they're often untrue, and they're images that we create of people based on a characteristic such as disability. So these aren't always bold and in your face, they can be quite subtle. Our stereotypes often extend beyond the person to talk about the person, how the person should properly experience the world. One common stereotype that many people hold are that disability will be something that people can see and people can understand and people can somehow sense in another person. This stereotype then shapes the language that we use to talk about disability. When we talk about disability, we often mean disability I can see. We often preface disability that I can't see with the word hidden, non-apparent, non-visible, or invisible. So disability is normal disability, disability that we can see, that's evidence, that's able to be understood. Hidden disability is something that's abnormal, it's different to normal disability. So even though no one will come out and say, look, this is a stereotype, this is what we expect, this very small, subtle difference in our stereotypes informs our expectations, and that expectation then informs how we support people with disabilities in the workplace and how we include disabled people in society. Just to make things even more complicated, the ways that we define different types of disabilities can also be understood differently depending on our stereotypes and expectations of what will be included in those disability groups. So if we look at one disability, neurodiversity or neurodivergence, neurodiversity is an umbrella term and it's also non-medical. So there are growing breadths of awareness that neurodiversity is more than just the diversity of the human brain. There is a lot more behind it. It's diversity in thinking behaviours, it's diversity in sensory understanding, everything like this. So neurodiversity isn't a deficit, or neurodivergence isn't a deficit, rather. It can be a strength in different ways. It can help understand complex concepts and completion of tasks in innovative and exciting ways. What this means, however, is when we use non-medical umbrella terms like neurodivergence or neurodiversity, we see the same issue that we do with disability. There is no one definition of what those terms are. Even if we look at things like, neurodivergence are people who think or learn or behave in ways that are considered deviant than wider society, that position is actually contradicted by other authors and other researchers in that field and other people in that field. So when we use non-medical umbrella terms like neurodivergence, we are incorporating our own ideas and stereotypes into what that will include. And that stereotyping might be different to how someone else would include or define or think about that particular experience. So we can already see how all of these things come together, the impact of our model, the impact of our context, the impact of our language, the impact of our understanding, the impact of our assumptions, the impact of our expectations, the impact of our stereotypes. So if we funnel all of that downwards, what that then leads us to is this. The way that we define different disabilities will be very different. What we include in the category of disabled will be different. What one workplace talks about with disability support will be different to another workplace. The way that you talk to a manager about disability or disability accessibility or modifications will be very different to another workplace. It's really good to be able to think about the different categorizations and the different ways that we think about disability and describe disability. But even in this, we need to also remember that people will have multiple different experiences. The person who has a disability, such as myself, I have dynamic disabilities such as ASD or autism spectrum, ADHD, mental health, as well as degenerative disc disease, which is physical disability. So the way that I define and understand and talk about my disabilities will be very different to the way that someone else talks about disability, and the way that my service provider, my GP, my employer, my manager will talk about disabilities. Yes, there will be similarities because we've grown up in the same context. But the core of all of this, and what I want us to remember and pull this all back to, is we cannot assume that someone else will define disability in the same way that we do. We cannot assume that someone else will think about neurodivergence or neurodiversity in the same way that we do. Just because we've got the same experiences of growing up in Australia, living in Australia, whichever, we have to understand the nuances of each disability. They're like fingerprints, they're all different, they're all unique. And we need to be flexible and open to hearing other people's definitions and experiences when we're talking about disability inclusive practice and neurodiversity inclusive practice. So let's bring this all together. So from our definitions, well, from our models to our definitions, from our definitions to our inclusion in practice. When we think about inclusion, we need to think about who are we inclusive of. Who we are inclusive of depends on our context, our assumptions, our beliefs and biases, our stereotypes and expectations, and our behaviours, practices and policies. This is kind of like the umbrella, working out from the little icon of the person, working outwards towards the pink inclusive of whom. This is how we form an inclusive practice. And if you've been like me and you've spoken about workplace adjustments and modifications to your manager, these are some of the reasons why those conversations might have went slightly sideways or not the way that you'd like them to go, or vice versa. These are ways that you can help bring those conversations back on that pathway by understanding that context, the assumptions, the beliefs, biases, stereotypes, expectations, behaviours, practices and policies of your manager as a person, of your manager as someone in that organisation, and that organisation as something that exists within a certain time, a certain period in Australia. The reasons why we need to think about these things and the reasons why we need to talk about disability definitions and how we're defining it and what it means when we say these things is because of all of these voices, these influences, these power brokers shaping how disability is talked about in society. So when we have people saying, well, disability is a dirty word, don't want to use that, or we say, well, neurodivergence can only include ASD and autism, or ASD and ADHD, that's all that can be included. When we're talking about these things, these are creating that context, these are perpetuating that context, and these are, again, influencing how disability is assumed and expected in that space. So being mindful of these things can help us, again, bridge those conversations and have a more inclusive practice, and also encourage a more inclusive practice in our workplaces. So tying that all together, the definition is only a definition, right? This is probably something you'll encounter in the workplace, but it's also something you'll encounter in society as well. But disability just means what disability means, and we don't need to investigate it, and it's more just navel gazing, and what does it even matter? So going back to the original context of this slide, arose by any other name, or why Australia has 9 definitions of disability. A rose by any other name might smell sweet, but people's perception of that rose could change depending on the language used to label that rose, depending on how people think about that rose. If we have different languages and different words for that rose, we also stop that communication from happening and that understanding from happening. The same with disability and neurodivergence. When we define disability and neurodivergence in a certain way and we don't talk about what that means, we can create environments or perpetuate environments where discrimination or ostracisation or just bad practices can happen because we don't think about what this means and how those boundaries can leave people out. One thing that I also encourage people to do when I do training sessions is to reflect on these statistics with the understanding that Australia is shaped by a lot of governance around disability. So there's the Disability Discrimination Act, there's the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, there's the Fair Work Act, there's the OH&S Act. There are so many different ones, and I'm happy to do a presentation just on the governance side of things and the legal side of things and what disability means in these things. But again, that governance is shaped within a certain context. It does not just form out of the ether. It is formed from a context. And that means even though we have these in place, they will only work in some ways and some areas. They are toothless dogs. They are big bites, but sometimes not big barks, but sometimes not that big of bites. So we will have discrimination happen. We will have workplace adjustments or changes to the workplace to improve inclusion refused, even with all of these things, because the way disability and neurodivergence is defined in these and the way it's defined in the workplace might not necessarily be inclusive of everyone. One common thing that I'm asked is, why do people with disability then, or disabled people as I prefer to say, why do disabled people not just say that there's an issue? Why do we not just jump up and start demanding that people talk about these sort of things? One of the reasons, and as the screen, I'll just close that one so you can actually see the screen, as the screen shows, sensory issues is something that's quite common across a lot of autistic people, but it's also something that people who aren't autistic can experience as well. So as someone with autism, I find bright lights very, very challenging. I find that low lights in particular just make me want to rip my hair out. And I find if I've run out of energy and I'm overwhelmed, that sensory input just makes me want to curl up and scream, and I can't explain it. And tags on shirts, don't even get me started on the tags and clothing. Don't get me started. So between 45 and 96% of autistic people are believed, the evidence, of course, that's broad, are believed to have sensory issues. So that's some form of issue with processing sensory input. So if we combine a sensory issue such as my light sensitivity with help seeking, so to get help on how to print a document, for example, I need to go to the library service desk. Library service desk is located underneath bright LED lights with lots of people walking around. It's noisy. I'm very stressed even before I go over there to get assistance. I might not ask for assistance or ask for help just because I don't feel like I can do, because the way that they've defined the disability accessibility in that space hasn't been accessible to me, because they don't know that I need these things. And this leads to one of the issues, that the ways that we define disability do shape how we start to support disabled people in workplaces, in general life, in general practice, in community groups, in schools, everything like that. So in my doctoral research, I referred to this as functional normalisation, and the idea is that we are more likely as a society to put in place modifications that address how we believe disability should be experienced based on our understanding of disability, e.g. our model. So if we live in Australia and we think disability is individual, it's medicalised, it can be proven, and it stops people functioning as normal, we will go, okay, so we're going to put in place things that help with people functioning, how they function. Our aim of that is to normalise the functioning so that the person can function as a normal person will do. So we'll put in place a ramp instead of stairs because that fixes the functional issue of the person who can't walk up the stairs. They can now enter the building in a functionally normal way. Because of that way of understanding disability, we're less likely to look at other modifications that might be as necessary in that space. So we might not think, going back to the previous slide, we might not think about sensory modifications and sensory accessibility and sensory safety, because even though it stops functioning, it doesn't stop functioning in a visible way. And the medical model tells us that disability should be something that we can evidence and be proven, and it's something that needs treatment, and it's something in the individual. So we don't really need to fix the environment, but it's just, yeah, it's all of those things. We don't need to change something in how we're doing it. We just need to put the ramp in because it's not a change to the environment, it's a change so that that person can function normally. So we get caught in all of these ways of thinking about disability and what's going to support disability. And this all again comes down to those definitions, comes down to those contexts, comes down to those understandings. So look at how each aspect comes together. Our stereotypes, our assumptions, our expectations of how people with a disability should exist, what disability will be, and how disability will be experienced, all then inform our standard around what disability is. Our standards of what disability are guided by those wider contextual model ideas around what disability will be experienced as and what disability means. So our decisions around what supports that we'll offer in the workplace, services, what venues we'll attend, or even what lighting we use in the workplace or school or everyday life will be informed by these assumptions, by these contexts, by these assumptions, by these definitions, by these expectations. And all of these together will then result into that practical action. So if we look at our model of disabilities again, so medical model disabilities inside someone, disability can be proven, disability can be evidenced, disability can be treated, disability can be improved, everything like that. We look at disability as something that demands evidence. So disability can be proven. We need to make sure that that disabled person isn't defrauding the system and not taken away from people who need it. But can everyone access sports to the same extent? If we save the nice tiles for special amazing guests, then we will go to our graves never having been visited by a special amazing guest because no one will ever meet that criteria. And that's what happens with our definitions. That's what happens with our frameworks of understanding disability. We create this idea of what disability will be, and from that, we create our expectations around what we will do to support disability. And more importantly, our expectations will not necessarily be the same as those in our workplaces or those of our managers, even though they are informed by the same context, even though they are informed by that Australian understanding of disability. There will be subtle differences of nuance, which are really, really powerful in the end impact of what inclusion will mean in that space and what things like workplace adjustments will mean in that space. Okay. On this slide, you'll see 3 different ways the workplace might talk about disability modifications or adjustments. Each of these is a modification or an adjustment made to something in the workplace to support people with disabilities. As you're reading them, think about who is going to be included in that adjustment. So I think the colour contrasters can see through space and time. Awesome, right? That might be great for someone who needs higher contrast to be able to clearly read something. Is that necessarily going to help someone who might read using Braille or someone who might use audiobooks, everything like this? Sure, well, make sure you've got a note taker in on your class and you can take bathroom breaks during the exam. It's not a worry. That's really, really great, but it assumes that the person with a disability, the student with a disability, has said that these are things that need to happen, has provided evidence that these need to happen, and is now being almost othered as different from everyone else from having these happen. Because if they're standing up to go to the bathroom during the exam, other people will notice. So are there ways that this could be more inclusive of more people? Do we need to limit this to only one person and then other them through the enactment of this? So the last one, so this is a closed shoe workplace. It's for your safety. I know the boots suck, but we like your feet attached to your body. Great, that's really, really good. It's great that we're making sure that physical safety of everyone is considered. What happens if they're like me and when I have a flare-up of my degenerative disc disease, it compresses my spinal nerves, which means that I can't actually bend. I actually can't even sit. I can't stand. I can't walk. I can't put on shoes. What about someone who might have arthritis in their hands? What about someone who might experience those difficulties with bending? What about someone who, also with my neurodivergence, particularly my ASD, I can't stand wearing shoes. I absolutely hate it. So what about people like me who will be distracted all day remembering that I've got shoes on because they're so heavy and they're so hot and I hate it? So who are these modifications inclusive of? More examples. A talking head video presentation that's super engaging. Absolutely it is. But what happens if someone struggles with the speed of the recording versus the processing speed of their brain? Do we also need to have a transcript available? How we communicate feels super comfortable and confident here working together. That takes a lot of courage to speak on your first day of class about how you will communicate. Are there ways that we can normalise that conversation, or are there ways that we can make that conversation a little bit more anonymous so people don't have to stand up and say, this is me, this is how I want to communicate? So let's chat about the relationships that we have with different areas or different shoe providers. Yeah, absolutely. But are those shoe providers in the budget range of the person with a disability? Are those shoes something that still meets the criteria? All of these different things. So from the very first stage, from looking at all of those contextual influences as how disability has changed in society, how our models and ways of understanding and think about disability have reflected those cultural changes and have really reinforced them in a way. How those models have then informed our governance, our legislation, our ideas around what disability is, and how we think about things like disability and neurodivergence. How these understandings have then shaped who is allowed in this space, how we put modifications in place, how we think about disability, how we think about neurodivergence, how we have conversations in our workplace around modifications, supports, and the assumptions we go in. Because I've been a manager, I can tell you, managers do not receive training in what disability modifications and disability adjustments are. We do not. We do not. We form that based on our own understanding, just like the person we're talking to, just like the staff member. So I know that's a lot to go through, and it's a lot to marinate in and to think about. And I tend to find myself that I think best when I've had a chance to marinate and then come back with questions. You are welcome to ask questions now, but you're also welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn to ask questions there or to email me through there. And you're also welcome to put questions up on the Padlet, which will be anonymous and can be answered by anyone in the community here. And I'll also pepper some thoughts on there as well. At the end of the day, the key thing that you need to remember, the thing that I want you to take away with you, is that we are inclusive only of the disabilities that we're prepared to be inclusive of. We're inclusive of the neurodivergence that we're prepared to be inclusive of. We're inclusive of the neurodiversity we're prepared to be inclusive of. We are only ever as inclusive as we are prepared to be. And how we are prepared to be will depend on all of these different things. So that draws an end to our presentation.